And now it's Boomer Life. Lifestyle ideas designed to make your life more engaging, meaningful, and complete. Celebrating the baby boomer generation, this is Boomer Life with Sterling Fox.
Well, hello. Welcome to Boomer Life here on AM 650. And on this episode of the program, we're talking about the latest innovation in hearing. We're going to talk about the inner workings of the ear, and we'll talk about solutions for those suffering from hearing loss and technology involved with hearing aids and the process of getting fitted to be able to hear like you want to. It's always a pleasure when we do these programs on hearing to welcome audiologist Dr. Ted Venema to Boomer Life. Good to see you again, Dr. Ted.
It's always nice to be back.
Well, it's good to have you. And just before we get into all this hearing stuff, you've just returned from a trip to Iceland, which for a Canadian is not exactly around the corner and up the street.
It's about a 7-hour flight out of Vancouver.
I hear it's a spectacular destination.
It is. It's quite the place.
Is
a little
that right?
bigger than the island of Ireland, up by the Arctic Circle. And the land is just this tortured, lava-strewn landscape with beautiful, though, just a gorgeous country.
Well, I'm glad you had a good time.
Absolutely. They fly direct out of Vancouver now. So
is that right?
Should check out Reykjavik.
Oh, okay. Well, it's good to have you back with us. I'm glad you made it all the way to Iceland and back in one piece. You're an audiologist. That's what I told everybody you were a moment or so ago. So what exactly, Dr. Ted Venema, is audiology?
Audiology, spelled O-D-D, audiology?
No, the other kind.
The other kind. Audiologists are kind of like optometrists for the eye, so an audiologist is for the ear.
Okay.
We test hearing, we prescribe hearing aids, we deal with anything to do with hearing. We're not surgeons, we're not doctors of like medical doctors, but we are like optometrists.
Okay.
Yep.
So you are licensed then to conduct hearing tests. And based on the information in the test, do you call it prescribe hearing aids? Is
That's
that the proper
one way to
word?
do it. Some people call it recommend, prescribe, but hearing aids do, and I'm glad you're saying that word because they do take a prescription, so to speak. Just like eyeglasses, lenses do for your eye, you get a prescription, and your glasses won't be right for somebody else. And the same is true with hearing aids and hearing loss. All hearing losses are different across the pitches, and so hearing aids have to be tuned specifically to match the needs of your particular hearing loss. Some have bass, some have treble. Papa sing bass. So you have different shapes of hearing loss, like an equalizer, lows to mids to highs. And so hearing aids don't just make sounds louder.
And I think that's a pretty popular myth, and at one point, it was absolutely true. That's all a hearing aid did. It had a little device in it that boosted the sound coming at you, and that was the best you could hope for.
And you had a volume control on the hearing aid.
That's right.
And you had a bit of a governor on the hearing aid that controlled its maximum output that it could put out so it doesn't cause more hearing loss.
Right. Now,
that's it.
How long ago did we begin to evolve away from that rudimentary technology?
Only in the past few decades.
Wow.
I'll say in the mid-1980s, hearing aids were still largely the hearing aids we were talking about, with a volume knob on them.
Right.
And, and they big fleshy colored things behind the ear.
Right.
And they had a volume wheel on, and that's all they did. And they were called linear. They amplified all sounds by the same amount.
Okay.
And you could amplify more or less with the volume. But now it's hearing aids that you can sculpt and shape the frequency response of a hearing aids. They have stuff on them called directional microphones, so they pick up sound in the direction you're facing. They have digital noise reduction on them. They have different programs on them.
And I would assume that if you have, for example, a good ear and a not so great ear, that they can be independently programmed, so you're getting more response and more assistance in one ear than you are in the other.
And what's more, they'll even talk to each other.
Oh, is
Those
that right?
two hearing aids you're talking about, one for a weak ear and one for a stronger ear, they can also speak to each other and coordinate sound so it's more natural for you.
Is it okay? Does it happen, Dr. Ted, where a person will be suffer profound hearing loss in one ear and be absolutely just fine in the other? So they'll only get one hearing aid, or do they always come in pairs?
Hearing aids they usually come in pairs because usually people develop hearing loss in both ears.
Okay.
I mean, the elderly, one ear isn't going to age faster than the other.
True.
And you start to lose treble hearing in both ears. Now, you might have had a whopping ear infection in one ear, or you might have had an injury, or noise exposure to one ear, or you might have had sudden idiopathic, which doesn't mean an idiot, but it means they don't know the reason why, sudden deafness in one ear.
Okay, yes.
Now, when an ear is dead, it's dead. You can't wring blood from a stone, laddie.
Gotcha.
Okay, if you got no hearing to aid, you can't aid.
Right, all right.
But what people do sometimes is they'll wear a microphone, a tiny little mic on the bad ear, and it'll direct sound to the good ear.
Oh, really?
That's called a cross hearing aid. So there's lots of different situations and scenarios.
Now, you used to work for, back when you were a young, aspiring audiologist, you spent some time actually in the employ of a Canadian hearing aid company.
Yep.
Where were they located?
The Mecca or Jerusalem of hearing aid companies is Kitchener, Cambridge, Ontario.
Okay.
For some reason, that's where most of them are.
That's where the BlackBerry folks hang their hats
yeah, there you
right?
go. Yeah. So, probably similar reasons. And anyway, I hope the companies serve a better fate than they did, though. At any rate, I worked for a hearing aid company called Unitron, which is Canada's only homegrown hearing aid company.
And was this at a time when the technology was really starting to take off and they were getting beyond that volume thing?
Yes, it was the golden age of hearing aids. I call it the 1990s. Was a flourishing or an explosion of hearing aid development. Analog hearing aids were all analog in the early 90s. And in the mid-90s, hearing aids became digital. So the first digital came out. But even the analog hearing aids were quite sophisticated. They had several different programs. They had directional mics. They just didn't have digital noise reduction.
Okay.
And they didn't have quite as many, as we say, channels. Because hearing aids are almost all today multi-channel.
Okay.
They'll have low, bass, mids, and treble channels that you can adjust separately.
Okay, and that takes us to the hearing test.
Yeah.
Now, you were fortunate. I was fortunate enough to have you arrange a hearing test for myself.
Yeah.
That I went through and was. I'd never had a hearing test. You know, I'm a boomer, for crying out loud. And especially I've been wearing headphones on the radio for too many decades. And I thought I would be a prime candidate for, almost one of those big old hearing bells that Uncle Scrooge used to carry around. Yeah. I thought I would be that messed up. And so I went to see Dr. Herman Lee at the Mainland Hearing Metrotown location, and I got the full-on, full-meal deal hearing test. And it was terrific. I really enjoyed it. And is the finding of the hearing test the foundation of the program for the hearing aid?
It is. The hearing test, when it's done, is called the audiogram.
Okay.
And the audiogram has decibels and it has frequency on it. And it's like a picture, so to speak, of your hearing levels across all the different pitches.
Okay.
From lows to mids to highs. And so some people have no hearing loss for the bass and they'll have a treble hearing loss. Some people will have the reverse. And so the results of your hearing test are called your thresholds, the level it takes for you to just barely hear a tone.
Okay.
And those hearing thresholds on your audiogram are entered into the computer, and the hearing aids that you're going to be wearing are hooked up to the computer, either by hard wire or by wireless Bluetooth, believe it or not.
Oh, okay.
And you program the hearing aids with hearing aid fitting software. So there's about 7 or 8 different hearing aid manufacturers, and each manufacturer has its own fitting software.
So when you get the hearing test, as I've done, and I'm lucky because I did not, Dr. Lee gave me I guess I passed. and it's such a silly word, but we're such an exam-oriented society. We've been going to school too long. But so you have to pass or fail. Well, I guess I passed because it wasn't recommended that I seek out
hearing was
some
within
hearing
normal
aids.
limits.
Exactly. But I'm a boomer, so there was notable hearing loss, just not so much so that I would require assistance.
Right, you were not deemed a hearing aid candidate.
Right, exactly. But is it safe to say, Dr. Ted, that all of us boomers have some hearing loss?
You know what? I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. Noise, if you're talking boomers, and we're talking boomers with noise, listening to loud music.
Yes,
noise,
which we've been doing since the 50s, as I recall.
And that will cause some treble hearing loss.
Okay.
Noise-induced hearing loss is treble, usually the trouble with treble. Okay? And the ramifications for hearing speech is you just can't hear those high-pitched consonants as easily.
Okay.
Like sh, t, and you're going to be asking people what they said. can hear, you just can't distinguish words that rhyme. And noise-induced hearing loss is pervasive, but not all boomers have it. It just depends whether you've, A, been genetically disposed to have hearing loss, and B, what kind of how have you savaged your ears with noise over time?
And us boomers, I'll tell you, we're pretty hard on the old ears, and we've been working hard at that for, well, I'm thinking especially since the 60s.
I know it.
When feedback and distortion was considered entertainment. I can recall those Jimi Hendrix days, and oh man, I mean, it was fantastic. But
if your ears weren't ringing afterwards, you didn't hear it right.
Well, that's it. Isn't that something? Now, let's just stop at that for a second, because how many times have anybody listening been to an event, usually a concert, but a car race will do it. We used to have the Molson Indy Vancouver. That'd get the old ears ringing if you had a good spot near the start-finish line. So when you come out of an experience like that, and you actually have this in your ears, that's tinnitus.
Tinnitus, tomato.
Okay.
It's
tinnitus.
Tinnitus, I say, some say tinnitus. I always think of an itis as an infection, but nonetheless, noise, that's a warning. That's nature's warning to you that you've had excessive noise exposure.
Okay.
The little tiny hairs in your inner ear are blown down, and they're telling your brain that you're hearing a sound when you're not. Overnight, they'll stand up again. It's just like walking on the grass. The blades will stand up again, but if you keep walking on it, you'll kill the grass. You keep exposing yourself to noise, and those hair cells inside the inner ear will die. And they're permanent. I mean, noise-induced hearing loss is the second, after aging, is the second most common cause of hearing loss.
Okay.
And the sickening thing about it is it's so utterly preventable.
Right.
So, I mean, we don't stare at the sun. I mean, everybody knows it's going to burn out your eye.
Absolutely.
But for some reason, we think the ear is impervious to noise. And that it's just, and it gradually kills you off.
We expose our ears to the audio equivalent of the sun and think nothing of it.
Most people think nothing of it. That's the crazy. Hearing is taken for granted.
Right.
I always think it's because we believe what we see. You can see blindness, but you can't really see hearing loss, and we believe what we see.
Right.
Eyes are given all the preference. And ears are somehow taken for granted, and people tend to spend 5 to 7 years suffering through hearing loss before finally doing something about it. Usually dragged in by a spouse who's sick and tired of it.
Who's tired of having you lip read instead of have a conversation.
Because hearing loss, unlike other types of senses, hearing involves necessarily another person.
Sure.
It's communication. So it involves not just the person who's got it, but it also involves the significant others around him or her.
Right.
It's a real conversation killer.
No kidding. I wanted to ask you about the noise, the exposure to noise, because back to that concert scenario, and I've been to a couple. Okay, a few dozen, where you come out of the place and you look at the people you went to the show with, and they're talking to you, and you don't hear a word you're saying because your ears are going. So the next morning you're usually okay.
You're usually all right.
So how long should you wait before you subject your ears to that sort of bizarre treatment? Give it a few months.
You shouldn't. You know what? You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't suppose. You should not. Sound that causes your ears to ring is sound you should avoid.
Oh, okay.
There's nothing wrong with loud sounds, but don't make it the length of which it is interacts with the intensity of the noise. It's the intensity of the noise plus the length of time you're exposed to.
Well, you see, that's why I asked you about how much time should you give your ears off for good behavior before you go do that again. And the reason I asked you was because in a concert scenario where we kind of OD on noise, that we do maybe 2 or 3 times a year. Maybe once a month if we're a real social animal. Still a controlled frequency. However, if you're on the job and there's a persistent daily exposure to a high degree of noise, and there's a lot of that tinnitus going on, a lot of that ringing, then you're really setting yourself up for some harm.
Usually they do hearing tests for workers and occupational things. They do that in the morning so that your ears have had overnight to chill.
Sure.
Okay. But I mean, it's like to say, like, how long should you take before you re-expose yourself to it? It's kind of like, well, how long should I take before I have another cigarette?
Right.
It's kind of like, well, the answer is kind of self-evident.
The answer is never.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly. So it's sounds that are loud enough to cause your ears to ring are sounds that you should avoid.
Right.
It's really our ears, and I said this before too, we're meant to hear the sounds of voices spoken over the crackling of a fire. That's what our ears were meant to hear.
So if we are, and I know in the last couple of months you were in Vancouver, you did a seminar for the gas company, the people at Fortis. When you're surrounded by professionals, working people who are in unsafe audio environments, what do you recommend? You say, guys, if you got to run that machine every day, 5 days a week, for crying out loud, wear some protection. And what sort of protection do industrial workers wear? Those little foam plugs, or do they wear the bigger, heavier duty ones?
Both. The little foam plugs aren't bad for periodic exposure to noise, but they're a drag to take out and put in because they get dirty and gross and everything. So the headphone types are the best. And places like Fortis and places that are major corporations, I mean, they're usually quite good at occupational safety.
Absolutely, it's in their own best interest.
Yeah, WorkSafe BC's got them got them well aware.
Right.
So today, occupational noise exposure isn't really the threat that it was a couple of decades ago. We're better at it now. But still, I do see guys, with people in those cars. Boom, boom, boom. The bling and the hibba. Where you hear the whole car. Boom, boom. Well, they're going to be
the
hearing
subwoofer in the trunk, the size of a small European country.
Exactly.
And the car, you hear the car 3 blocks before you see it. Right? Yeah.
Or when you hear someone's headphones and you're on a bus and you hear the person's music and
there's somebody doing harm.
Yeah.
And
so it's recreational noise exposure is really a bad one.
Our guest on this episode of Boomer Life, in which we're talking all about hearing, is audiologist Dr. Ted Venema from NexGen Hearing and Mainland Hearing. And you can find out a lot more about those operations on the net at nextgenhearing.com. And NexGen, by the way, friends, is NEXGEN hearing.com. And Mainland Hearing, well, we're pretty good with Mainland Hearing in the lower mainland of BC, mainlandhearing.com. More with Dr. Ted on Boomer Life after this quick timeout.
Canada's only weekly radio show dedicated to the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on AM 650.